For most of WWE's history, there was one world champion, but there have been points where this has not been the case. 2 points, in fact. And it's the second belt which was introduced during these periods, which we're going to be looking at right now in the history of the WWE World Heavyweight Championship. It started in 2002. Prior to that, WWE had one world title on their books, or at least one world title for the men. That had been the case ever since the WWF title was first won by Buddy Rogers back in 1963, and it had remained the case throughout the eras of subsequent stars like Bruno Sammartino, Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and The Rock. As the new millennium got into full swing, however, there would be change in the air which necessitated something radically different be done. What was this change? Well, it was the brand extension. Yes, after acquiring both WCW and ECW in 2001, and with this, a large chunk of each promotion's roster, Vince McMahon had initially tried to run his former top competitor as its own separate brand with its own separate titles. But when that failed to get off the ground, he was instead forced to go with the infamous Invasion angle, one which was so poorly executed, it was done by the time the winter had arrived. But while the Invasion was now over, the bloated roster remained. And so this was why the boss came upon the idea of creating his own competition going forward by dividing his talent pool into two groups, one which would be exclusive to Raw and another which would be exclusive to SmackDown. And this was exactly what happened on March 25, 2002, as that was the night the first draft took place, a draft which saw names like The Undertaker and Kane become Monday Night Only acts, all while others such as The Rock, Kurt Angle, and Hulk Hogan were moving over to Thursdays full-time. What did this mean for the world title? Well, at first it was business as usual, as after the Invasion came to a full end at Vengeance the prior year when Chris Jericho unified both the WWF and WCW world belts, he'd become the first ever undisputed champion. And while he was no longer in possession of that when the brand split happened, the person who was, Triple H, would have a passport to go between both shows for as long as he held it. Yes, the idea here was that, like with the NWA World's title during the Territory days, the undisputed champion would go between Raw and SmackDown and take on all challengers who were put up against him. But while this was a good idea in theory, pretty quickly Vince McMahon decided it wasn't something which was working for him in practice, as after a few months of the likes of The Game, Hulk Hogan, The Undertaker, and The Rock being traveling champs, the booking issues began to show themselves, with the main issue being that if the undisputed champion was over on Raw working a program for a month, then it left SmackDown with a lot less to do in terms of their own main event scene. Could this situation have been alleviated by raising the likes of the Intercontinental title and the United States title to the level of regional top prizes? Maybe, but that's not what the boss went with in the end. No, instead Vince had both Raw and SmackDown general managers Eric Bischoff and Stephanie McMahon each court Brock Lesnar after he won the Undisputed title from The Rock at SummerSlam that August and try to get him to sign full-time to their show. And when Stephanie and the SmackDown brand came out the winner in this bidding war, the door was suddenly open for a new top prize to be announced. What would this new top prize be? Well, that would become evident on the September 2nd, 2002 edition of Raw, as that was the night Eric Bischoff came out to present Triple H with a very special gift. That's right, it was here that EZE officially crowned the game as the inaugural World Heavyweight Champion, with the belt being used for this being the old big gold belt first made famous by Ric Flair back in his WCW days. Obviously then, the symbolism was clear here, and that symbolism was that, while this wasn't the WCW World Heavyweight title, it was a spiritual successor to it in many ways. But why had Triple H simply been awarded it without having to fight anyone for it? Well, in kayfabe, the reason was that Bischoff saw him as being the clear number one guy on the brand, way above any of the baby faces. Whatever the truth was, however, it didn't really matter. No, all that mattered was now, for the first time in WWE's history, there were two recognized world champions, one for each brand. And while the WWE title was seen by many, if not most, as the real top prize given the lineage it had, which went all the way back to George Hackenschmidt, it wouldn't take long for the new prize to gain credibility in its own right. How did it do this? Well, a large part of the reason was because it was held by Triple H for so long here. Yes, with the game arguably being the most recognizable mainstream act the company had on a full-time basis back then due to both his success in the Attitude Era and the fact that Steve Austin and The Rock each had one foot out the door, it meant he was able to add a sense of gravitas to the new gold. That said, he wouldn't be the only person who'd hold it here. No, aside from him, there would also be short reigns from the likes of Shawn Michaels, Goldberg, and Randy Orton. Hell, Randy Orton's win at SummerSlam 2004 would actually make him the youngest world champion in WWE history, a record which still stands to this day. And as for HBK's big victory, well, that would mark his last run as a world champion during his in-ring career. That said, for as notable as these victories were, the reality remained that between the autumn of 2002 and the spring of 2005, this was Triple H's belt. So much so that he was never not in possession of it for longer than a few months. Hell, there's a reason this period is known as the Reign of Terror. And that's because the future head booker held such a stranglehold over the gold here, the show became incredibly frustrating to watch at times for many fans, and managed to turn more than a few people off entirely, as so many promising potential champions like Rob Van Dam, and perhaps most infamously Booker T, were buried by the game. Thankfully though, this reign of terror wouldn't last forever, and when it did end, it ended in a major feel-good way, which made it feel worthwhile. What was the climax to this story in 2005? Well, after the game had formed Evolution a couple of years prior, and had started building up a then young upstart by the name of Dave Batista to serve as his protege, the Animal eventually tired of his boss's bullying ways, and after winning the 2005 Royal Rumble, challenged him and beat him in the main event of WrestleMania 21 to take home the gold for himself. That's right, going forward, Batista was now the new World Heavyweight Champion, something he solidified by beating Triple H clean twice more on pay-per-view in the months following. But he wouldn't be a Raw exclusive for much longer because during the 2005 draft, a major spanner was thrown into the works of WWE's main event scene. What was that spanner? Well, it involved Big Dave and then WWE champion John Cena switching brands, with that meaning the Animal and, as a consequence, the World Heavyweight title would now become exclusive property of SmackDown. Why had this been done? Well, back then, Raw was still very much seen as being the A show, and so because of that, it was felt it needed both the new top star of the company in John Cena and the real top prize in the WWE title on its TV every week. That's right, after fighting the perception that it was secondary to the real world title for years prior to this, the move over to the Thursday nights only seemed to solidify the fact that the World Heavyweight Championship would never be the #1 piece of hardware in WWE. No, at best, it could only be a 1A, but that still made it a very valuable prize, valuable enough that if you were a men's wrestler on SmackDown, this represented the highest peak you could achieve. And that was why everyone on that brand wanted a piece of it over the months which followed. That said, in the end, no one person would be able to take it away from Batista. Rather, he'd be ultimately forced to vacate it in January of 2006 when a tricep tear put him on the injury shelf. So what happened next then? Well, a tournament would be held to crown a new champion, a tournament eventually won by Kurt Angle. And this set up a situation where, at WrestleMania 22, the Olympic hero would defend against both Randy Orton and Rey Mysterio. Needless to say that if you were watching at the time, you no doubt remember that as the show where Ray won the big one in honor of Eddie Guerrero, someone who had passed away only a few months prior as a result of a heart attack at just 38 years old. Yes, it was another true feel-good moment, but not one which would last because, as the months progressed and Mysterio's title run got going, it became apparent that Vince McMahon didn't see much in him as a tippy-top guy, primarily because he was under 6 feet in height. So because of that, Ray's reign would be mostly characterized by him losing frequently in non-title matches, barely eking out wins when the belt was on the line, and then eventually dropping the gold to King Booker at the Great American Bash in July of that year. Still though, even if Ray's run was massively botched, King Booker's subsequent go-around on top went a lot better. In fact, this was the point that Booker T first truly felt like a top guy in WWE. And that, in turn, helped to raise the value of the big gold belt up again after it had been damaged during the move over from Raw to SmackDown. Would this momentum be able to continue for the World Heavyweight title as the decade progressed? Yes, and we say that because it would be held by a number of additional main eventers over the next few years. We're talking about names like The Undertaker and Edge here. Hell, so strong would these two men's runs be, they'd even main event WrestleMania 24 together with the World Heavyweight title on the line, with that being the first time such a thing had happened since Dave Batista's big win 3 years prior. Honestly, if you were to pick one person who became most synonymous with the big gold belt during the mid to late 2000s, then it would probably be the rated R superstar. That said, for as strong as his run was, there were some stinkers in there too, The most notable of which was probably the great Khali's run in the summer of 2007, a contender for worst world title run of all time if there ever was one. But again, change was about to come, and soon this SmackDown brand would no longer be the home of the World Heavyweight title. No, it was time for it to switch around once more, something which was done in order to freshen up WWE's main event scene. How would the shift happen this time? Well, rather than it happen as a result of the champ getting drafted, it would instead be a Money in the Bank cash-in which did it, as it was on June 30th of 2008 that CM Punk used his guaranteed world title shot on Edge to take home the gold for himself. And because Punk was a Raw wrestler here, that meant the big gold belt would once more be a part of Monday nights, for a little while at least. That's right, while Raw would now be the home of the World Heavyweight title, this new arrangement only lasted for a year. But during that year, there were a lot of noteworthy moments created, two of the biggest of which were probably Chris Jericho winning it and using it as a prize for the grand finale of his excellent feud with Shawn Michaels, and John Cena claiming it as his own for the first time in his career. Come the summer of 2009, however, it would be back on Thursday nights, as that was when Jeff Hardy won it and then proceeded to bounce it between himself and the Second City Saint for the next couple of months, as SmackDown audiences got reacclimatized to having this particular piece of hardware back on the show again. How would things fare for the belt from here as the 2000s ended and the 2010s dawned? Well, there would be ups and downs, as while the runs of people like Christian were pretty good, there were also some major low points, as can be seen in the period where Jack Swagger and a now much older Kane were in possession of the gold. And it also hurt that the man most commonly associated with the World Heavyweight title in many ways, Edge, would be forced to vacate it before he could drop it on account of a neck injury so bad no doctor would clear him to return to action for the next 9 years. But perhaps worst of all was the fact that with the belt being a SmackDown exclusive again here, its perception amongst fans was seriously damaged, as this was the point that the Blue brand effectively became a recap show for Raw for a couple of years. That's right, by now the brand extension really only existed in theory, as SmackDown wrestlers were regularly appearing on Raw. And whenever the World Heavyweight title was brought over to Monday nights, it was very clearly being positioned as inferior to the WWE title. Really, come the early 2010s, the gold had ceased to be a true world title in many fans' eyes, and was more in line with what the Intercontinental strap had been back during the 80s and 90s, something which still had value, but which was going to be fought over primarily by the mid-card. And that could be seen in some of the champions we got as the decade fully got going. We're talking about names like Mark Henry and The Big Show here. Yes, Alberto Del Rio and Sheamus, two guys who were still in the higher end of the WWE pecking order, would get their runs too, but this seemed more like a demotion of them at the time rather than an elevation of the title. And then there was Daniel Bryan's run, a run which was never supposed to happen in the first place and which only came about after Mark Henry got injured and the American Dragon just so happened to be in town that night so he could cash in his Money in the Bank contract. Sure, Bryan may have been the best wrestler in the world in 2011, but the fact that the belt was given to him so haphazardly here said it all about how Vince McMahon saw not only him, but the World Heavyweight title in general. Basically, what we're saying here is that during the early 2010s, the prize, which had initially been introduced as being something on the same level as the WWE title, was in dire straits, and was fast losing whatever relevance it was still able to cling on to. That said, even with the depths it was falling to, there was one last hurrah it would get, a final moment of greatness, if you will, and that moment would come on the April 8th, 2013 episode of Raw. What happened here? Well, this was the night that Dolph Ziggler cashed in his own Money in the Bank contract to win the gold from Alberto Del Rio. That's right, arguably the greatest cash-in of all time occurred here, one which got a monstrous pop from the crowd in attendance once they realized what was happening, as finally, it looked like the show-off was about to ascend to that next level. Sadly though, Ziggler would not end up rising up the card permanently, and before long, the World Heavyweight title was back to being a glorified mid-card belt. So much so that once the brand split officially ended soon thereafter, it became clear it had no reason to exist anymore. And so that was why in the winter of 2013, the man then in possession of it, John Cena, laid out a challenge to then WWE Champion Randy Orton that the two have a ladder match where both pieces of gold would be on the line, and the winner would unify them into one single WWE World Heavyweight title. Yes, for the first time in over a decade, there was going to be one undisputed champion in WWE again. And with this new belt carrying on the lineage of the more important WWE title, it meant the World Heavyweight title's time would come to an end here. Well, kind of. because after the Viper beat Big Match John to unify both prizes at December 15th's TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs pay-per-view, the belt would continue to appear on TV for a few months, as the new title was represented by both of the former Raw and SmackDown pieces of hardware. So because of that, when Daniel Bryan came out victorious in the main event of WrestleMania 30, one of the two belts he'd hold over his head would be the big gold belt. And when he was forced to vacate a few months later and John Cena won it at Money in the Bank, the same situation would play out with him too. Really, it wasn't until the night after SummerSlam in August of 2014 that the title, which once represented WCW, would officially be retired, as by that point, a new single title would be introduced to serve as the WWE World Heavyweight Championship going forward. Did that mean we would never see the big gold belt on WWE TV again? Sadly, yes. But it wouldn't be the last time a second world title was introduced in WWE, as once the brand extension was reinstituted in 2016, the WWE World Heavyweight title became a SmackDown exclusive, with this leading to the Universal title being created for Raw. Again though, like had happened before, those two belts would end up being unified when, at WrestleMania 38 in April of 2022, Roman Reigns pinned Brock Lesnar to continue his reign of dominance over the company as its tribal chief by becoming the undisputed WWE Universal Champion. Given he was a blue brand wrestler then, what did this mean for Raw? Well, at least initially it meant that, similar to what had happened with the undisputed title back in 2002, Roman would be able to go from show to show as a traveling champion. Hell, this actually made all the sense in the world, as at that point he was still carrying around both belts, signifying that they could technically be separated again. But while this was a good idea initially, after a while it became clear it wasn't going to work because, with Reigns by this point being a part-timer, it felt like he was only showing up to TV a handful of times a year. And given the fact that most of those dates were taking place on SmackDown, Monday nights was really going to need a top prize of their own again. So it was that in the spring of 2023, Triple H would come out to the ring on an episode of Raw to announce the creation of a new world title, the World Heavyweight title. Needless to say then, this felt instantly familiar to fans of the 2000s and early 2010s, especially as the design of the belt paid some serious homage to the big gold belt Ric Flair had made his own back in the day. But technically, this one would not carry on the same lineage as the previous World Heavyweight title. No, it would start an all-new lineage, one which would immediately make it difficult for this piece of gold to be thought of on the same level as the one Roman Reigns had. So that meant whoever was going to hold it first would have a tall task ahead of them when it came to establishing it as something which could stand as the most sought-after prize on the red brand. Luckily then, the first person to hold it would be more than up to this task, as that man would be none other than Seth Rollins, one of WWE's top in-ring performers for as long as he's worked for the company. That's right, after he became the inaugural champ upon beating the Phenomenal One at Night of Champions on May 27th that year, he defended with much more frequency than his former Shield brother was doing with his world title over on SmackDown. What effect did this have? Well, the main effect was that it positioned the World Heavyweight title as the workhorse belt, the one the real wrestlers wanted to go after, similar to the reputation the Intercontinental title had when it was at its peak during the 80s and 90s, all while making the undisputed WWE Universal title feel like the Hollywood prize, the one people like Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar were after. Yes, like that, this new belt had an identity of its own, separate from the other men's world title in the company. And with Seth almost always delivering a show-stealing performance each time he defended it, fans quickly came to embrace it, even those who weren't too excited about it being reintroduced in the first place. Hell, so successful would Rollins be in his role as ace of the Raw brand throughout 2023, he'd still be holding the gold well into 2024, all the way up until WrestleMania in April, in fact. That said, for as great of a run as Seth had here, it was always going to have to come to an end eventually, and this would occur at WrestleMania itself when the champ was bested by Drew McIntyre. Obviously then, given how great his 2023 had been, fans expected this to be the start of a long run on top for the Scotsman, but that was not to be because after CM Punk helped to lay Drew out once the belt was over, Damian Priest would run down to the ring to successfully cash in his Money in the Bank contract. How would Priest's run go from here? Pretty well as it happened, especially considering this was his first run as any kind of world champion at all. And there lay the value of the World Heavyweight Champion during the 2020s, as if the WWE title was going to be the domain of performers such as Roman Reigns, Cody Rhodes, and John Cena, the tippy top names in the company, then the top prize on Raw allowed for people who were bubbling under the main event level to elevate themselves to the next rung on the ladder. Just look at the man who eventually beat the Archer of Infamy for the gold, the mighty Gunther. Yes, after his record-breaking 666-day run as Intercontinental Champion, he'd be able to fully establish himself as a main event player by winning the World Heavyweight title in August of 2024. And he wasn't the only person who was going from the upper mid-card to the main event with a well-placed world title win over on Raw around this time, as at WrestleMania 41 in April of 2025, Jey Uso would get his own go-around with the gold, something which capped off a meteoric rise he'd had in WWE during the years prior. Of course, as things stand today though, neither Gunther nor Jey Uso are the champ. No, after the latter lost the belt back to the former, and then the former very briefly lost it to CM Punk, a move which made the Second City Saint the only man to hold both versions of the title, it would move back on to the inaugural champion Seth Rollins again. And once Seth had it back, it seemed like he was going to go on another lengthy run on top, as with the Vision by his side, he was fully the ace of Monday nights once more. Unfortunately though, one thing you can't prepare for in wrestling is injuries. And it would be an injury that the Architect picked up in October of 2025, which forced him to vacate the gold he'd just won 2 months prior. So for that reason then, the belt was vacated, to be awarded to the victor of a match between #1 contender CM Punk and winner of a battle royal to determine his opponent, main event Jey Uso, at Saturday night's main event on November 1st, which was ultimately won by the Second City Saint. Really though, the long play doesn't seem to be Punk calling himself the champ, rather it seems to be Braun Breaker who's being set up to eventually win it. That's right, the man who's already being positioned to one day take over Roman Reigns' role as King of WWE will likely first hold a top prize when he inevitably wins the World Heavyweight title, possibly as soon as WrestleMania 42. What will this mean for the overall legacy of the belt which, a break in lineage aside, goes all the way back to Triple H in 2002? Well, it can only add to its prestige. Of course, this is probably something it deserves, as while it might not have been around for as long, either in its first iteration or the second, the people who have held it make up a who's who of some of the biggest stars of their era. Come on now, when a prize has been around the waist of legends like Triple H, Batista, John Cena, Randy Orton, Chris Jericho, and more, how can it ever truly be considered anything less than top tier? So expect its status to only grow even more as the years go on, and additional stars of the past, present, and future add their names to its list of holders.